Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCG live codes, make sure you check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your orders using that code OmniPoke. For today's video, we're going to be going over the tournament results for the Vancouver and Fortaleza Regional Championships. Both happened last weekend, and of course this is the knee-jerk reaction to that EUIC, the first time in North America that we can see a major with prismatic evolutions, which was quite interesting. And of course the EUIC was fairly chaotic in its results, actually, with the Gholdengo top 4, a couple Snorlax in that top 8, and of course the Clorf Terapagos being the eventual winner. So a lot of storylines coming out of EUIC that probably shook up the narrative and the expectation just, 1 week before, or 2 weeks before Vancouver, which is really interesting. So let's get into the day one metagame. Dragapult is carving itself out as sort of like the safe best deck in the game, and then it has game plans into the majority of the other top strategies right now. I think really Lugia is the only one of the sort of top decks that we can look at, which is somewhat of a concern matchup, I would say. And even then you have lines of play available to you. This 19% is going to be split between the Dusknoir builds and the pure Badoo builds. Of course, both of those doing well at EUIC, and again, we'll see both of those builds doing well today in Vancouver and Fortaleza. So the tug of war continues of which is the better option, and still which A-spec is still up in the air as well to an extent, which is really interesting to see. But it does sort of change the matchups of both these archetypes. But I think there's also a number of pilots who have just made the trip back from EUIC, didn't make too many changes, just small tweaks to deck lists. So are still like adapting the list themselves that little bit and maybe not making huge scale changes to deck lists, even though there are sort of new ones up in the air. It looks like then there's a sort of tug of war for the next three most popular. Quite interesting for me to see no Miraidon in the day one field. I think that would have been fairly routine pre-EUIC. Then it didn't have the best day one to day two, but most importantly, the day two placements for Miraidon weren't that high. It sort of retained its placements from day one to two, but wasn't really reaching those higher echelons. So that sort of fell out of favor. And what came in, I think, as that aggressive option is the Gholdengo, which was really popular from some of the high-profile US players who came over to Europe and, again, continued to play it themselves, but also, gained more popularity, gained more traction as a fairly well-placed archetype. It has the Monkey Dory, it has the Churro to be annoying for the Dragapult players, and then it just has that huge stopping power with Make It Rain itself as a very powerful attacking option that allows you to race effectively, definitely into stuff like Miraidon, like Archaludon. You have a decent time there. So yeah, Gholdengo really solidifying its place, and it's getting more and more secure, I think, as a deck in the meta. As it's going to continue. Of course, we still have a tournament in Stockholm and, of course, over in Australia in this format, so it's still really relevant to look at prismatic evolutions before we turn our attention to post-row. Gardevoir, had a really good day one to day two in Europe, but didn't have that high eventual ending placements. I think just a couple in top 16. Still 10% in popularity, still up there, certainly. And then Lugia, that's also that sort of talking point, I think, because Miraidon didn't have that barnstorming event in the EUIC. The runway was sort of clear once again for Lugia. And of course, there's the narrative that players are trying their pet decks for the last time before rotation as well, and possibly there's some percentage towards Lugia for that reason also. Archaludon, had a decent time in Europe. It didn't have the best day one to day two conversion, I don't think, if I recall. I think it just retained its place. Did have a fairly high finish, but not in the sort of droves we expected. And I think randomly Archaludon's just been the deck that more Europeans have played than the US players, so that's something to bear in mind. And I guess there was the fear factor going into Vancouver, since Gholdengo had that big finish, and that's a really bad matchup for Archaludon, so there is a reason for that to be dipping in popularity. And then Clorf is the final deck on the day one graphic for that popularity. Just came off with a big win, and pilots wouldn't find it too difficult to pivot to this deck because it was, a deck before Prismatic Evolutions. It just gained Badoo, and I think that was one of the first things a lot of pilots tried in the first place because it's one of the best abusers of Badoo because you get the damage mod with it. So I think it's not surprising that people were able to pivot back to Clorf because they probably tried it at the start of Prismatic in the first place, and they didn't need much more encouragement. Let's have a look at the day two percentages then. This is how they converted from day one to day two. Dragapult's still out there way in front, but did lose a bit of percentage. I think that's common when you see a deck as popular as that. You knock out your opponents when you're facing in mirror matches and such, but still doing respectably. Same for Gardevoir, same for Gholdengo, and interestingly, same for Lugia. So Lugia was really scared off by the fear of Miraidon, but when Miraidon doesn't make the day one graphic, it's a much more well-placed archetype in that you are very frustrating for the Pult players. and you have ways of creating a difficult prize map with Iron Hands and with your Legacy Energy and with your Chinchinos, of course, as well, for a number of other high-tier decks. So that one last ride with Lugia still looking pretty good. Clorf did well day 1 to day 2, but it was the Archaludon which couldn't really keep up with possibly a less favourable metagame for it with that Gholdengo now, and also with Gardevoir, still reaching those further places in day 2. It does feel like the things you're trying to target as Arch may not be as relevant. I mean, Dragapult's still up there, certainly. That's still one of your bigger boasts if you're playing the Archaludon variant. But it feels like there are other more awkward matchups out in that field as well, rising to the higher tables. And in its place, it was the Pikachu Lost Zone box. Again, another sort of last ride right there with the Lost Zone engine that made it onto that day 2 of the graphic. And we saw, of course, Grant Manley with a pretty high placement of Lost Box at the EYC. And I think that's what a number of pilots used as a baseline going into this tournament, which is pretty interesting. Outside of those top 6 then, Miraidon was next, then Arch, so it did fall quite substantially down a couple of places, like, what was it, 3 or 4 places? Snorlax had that great EYC and is still doing well, is always a good converter, even if it's not that popular going into day 2 of the field. Roaring Moon's an interesting one. We'll put a pin in that until we look at the deck lists, because both in Vancouver and Fortaleza, there's some big spikes for Roaring Moon. Could end up being, a tug of war with Miraidon and Roaring Moon as sort of the best basics to play, and Clorf as well, I suppose, as the decks, the big basics in the room. And I guess Lost Box, there's so much to look at in terms of big basics. Raging Bolt still hanging on in there, Regidrago hanging on in. Ceruledge, there's an interesting list to look at from Fortaleza there as well. Pudra Control, we have a list to look at. And then some of the sort of 2s and 1s of the less popular, often less consistent decks. But seeing Reggie's in day 2, pretty surprising as well. So might have to take a look at that deck list. But let's start at the top then. And it's another regional win for Andrew Hedrick. Hard to put into words just how consistent and powerful Andrew has been. And when you look at his deck list, just to say, it's also the same list he piloted at the EYC. Same for Justin from the Seniors Division, who got top 8 and got another result as well. So both Andrew and Justin getting placements at EYC and then flying over to Vancouver, trusting the same 60 and getting a big result, and also a 4th place finish for Carson in Vancouver. So a really successful 60. And it's a no-nonsense list, really. There's nothing you can point at that looks out of place. All the counts make sense. And yeah, it seems like a good balance of consistency and keeping that power in there with the Dusknoir, having the option to use your Curse Blast for math fixing. It all just makes sense. And I think that really is the philosophy. When I point to Hedrick lists, you just know that it's no nonsense. Play your way through the game, have as much consistency as you can just to get into games, and just let your sort of own flair and play style push you through to the far end of the tournament. And he's once again had this phenomenal record. Really, this philosophy of deck building from Hedrick reminds me of like Tord from 5 years ago, which is such a weird thing to say because Tord's become so nebulous and at such a high level of play that he like transcends traditional deck building like logic, that regular players, regular humans like me, can't figure out like his counts, and they look off and strange at times, whereas Hedrick is doing what Tord initially did when he started winning all those ICs way back when, where he just has good counts of everything good that makes sense on paper, and you let your play do the talking. So it's a really interesting thing that Andrew is certainly one of the like up and coming players. Like over the last 2 seasons, I think you put his results up against basically everyone, and you say that he's one of the best in the world currently. Like that's just unquestionable. So it's a question of just how far Andrew can go with more and more placements like this, because he is cold as ice when you see him on the tables, and yeah, his deck lists are no nonsense, so you're never going to catch him bricking, really, which is kind of just a sick thing to see. Lucas Xing in at 2nd place with Gholdengo. Again, a lot of the US players took the same idea from EYC and made a few tweaks, where they still have the core of like just Dengo, and the Monkey Dory, of course, chipping in the water energy so you can attack with Greninja if need be. But interestingly, a number of these players opted to have a Strike It Rich single prize Gholdengo, which just does for 1 metal, 30 plus 90 more if you evolve from Gimme that turn. Sure, it can do some prize offsetting, but I think this is mostly in here just as a Cornerstone Ogerpon counter. Even though you don't knock out a Cornerstone, they have to attack this, I think, and then you can just like stretcher it back and hit with it again is the idea. Or you can like strike it rich and use other stuff like Adrenabrains and whatnot if they're trying to punch around other things, So Yeah, I think that's in here for the cornerstone. Maybe there's another prize offset thing you can try and do with it at times. Of course, you have Roxanne in the list now as well. Something they didn't have was any hand disruption previously. Now they have the rocks. So maybe there is a chance where you can like set up math with a Roxanne on a strike it rich turn and hope that you can like finish things off in that regard. But then the other new inclusion is the Spiritomb, which I think is respect for Snorlax whilst also collateralling, you know, like a handful of decks utilizing those Vs. Obviously, Rotom's popular in Dragapult, and of course, Lugia still relies a lot on Lumineon. So, yeah, the Spiritomb is causing somewhat of a headache in the list as well, which is always nice when you're, you know, quad poffin. So, once you get those gimmies out, you normally float to the extra basic, which can be that tomb. But outside of that, it's the same like core strategy that we've seen from the EUIC, and just those few tweaks to respect the changing meta. Very, very strong deck building from Lucas once again, who is also a very consistent player over the last few seasons and has great results. One of the big stories, I think, is Leibui with the Roaring Moon in top 4. And again, just quickly skipping to Fortaleza, there's another Roaring Moon that makes top 8 as well. So this is a deck that certainly underplayed for how powerful and how far it can go. Again, it had that amazing Worlds finish, don't forget. Obviously a different format, but this deck continues to be under-respected and continues to go far in tournaments, where this list is just having that high item density that we have come to know, so you can get a lot of Pokestop value whilst weaving in your Sadas. You have that aggression at your disposal. There's nothing spicy or special about the list. I think the most exciting card to look at is the Penny. Penny Palpad, as well as Petulant in the list, gives you a really great time against any controlling matchup. We know that for certain. And the Pidgeot that gets top 8 ended up having to face Leibui, which is, unfortunate for the Pidgeot player, no doubt. But that's some boast that you have as Roaring Moon, as one of the aggressive decks that can take on control, which is powerful. But also, anyone getting creative with Gardevoir or with Dragapult gets instantly punished by a Penny play, because they may not be expecting that. I think they would just expect Switch Cart, typically. So the fact that you can heal off that damage as the opponent's trying to set up and avoid Pheasantipity and whatnot, you can really punish that play, buying back huge amounts of tempo. So, yeah, I think this is a threat in the format, certainly, and still one of the more consistent low-to-the-ground decks that can still continue to go far. I think I prefer the list from Fortaleza, so I'm going to hold off on my opinions for that, but Roaring Moon, just as a general talking piece and a general discussion, still very powerful. Caleb brought Miraidon to the EUIC for a pretty high placement, but did even better still this time around. Stuck with the same 60. When I look at the list, I still hate the fact that there's no Hisuian Heavy Ball in the list with so many integral one-offs. But at the same time, I can't see a cut. So it's one of those things where I kind of just have to grimace and accept it, because there's no easy choice to take anything out of the deck list. It has everything you want, and there's no like additional counts of cards that you can really think as easy cuts. I think like the biggest thing to look at would be, I don't know, like Vacuum and Rotom are like the most flexy. Maybe Zapdos if we're thinking there's going to be less Arch going ahead. If it's only that like 7%, maybe you can accept the Zapdos coming back out and turning that into a heavy ball. But otherwise, like, yeah, looking really, really good for Caleb. Another great result with the Miraidon. Trevor Reed also playing the Gholdengo. Wasn't playing the same 60 as the other US contingents. Instead, you know, still chose to play the Spiritomb on his own end, but didn't have the Strike It's rich Gholdengo, sticking more true to the EUIC high-performing 60 from Xander by the looks of things. There's more great Canadian representation, and Neil also making top 8 here with the sort of straight Dragapult build with no Dusknoir in here at all. Looks like it's a lot more inspired by the Fernandez brothers and their list. I think the only few changes here is it's cut the Lost City, because that's far less relevant if Gardevoir's not like public enemy number 1. Interesting to see the second Crispin in here. That does like allow you to weave in the Monkey a little bit more aggressively, which is one of your like most powerful cards, certainly in Mirror Match and whatnot. And I think it's weaved in one rare candy, where I'm not certain the Fernandez brothers played one. So just a few small tweaks there. But yeah, again, really good list. Anil, don't let his funny persona fool you. He is certainly a player. Really, really strong pilot of the deck. Played very well on stream as well at times. And is still a very humble player, but definitely a powerful one. And still representing that both the Dusknoir and straight builds can do very well. Hiroshi in top 8 with the Archaludon. So always nice to see, because this is a deck that I'm still trying to pilot in this format. I really like the small adaptations of having the one black belt, even within a Dialga build. I think there's been that big debate of like the straight build playing 1 or 2 black belts in the Palpad, and like elevated boss count and whatnot, whereas the Dialga kind of just leaned all into Dialga. Now you have Dialga V-Star and a Black Belt's training and a Power Pad in the list. I think that allows you to fight into Gholdengo that little bit better. I still think it's a matchup you're not happy to see, but it does allow you to actually play the game, which I think is a big deal. The only small thing for me is like, I feel like Jamming Tower's losing its value, where there's some Pults that aren't playing Crystal anymore, and there's like, Gardevoir's still the second most popular deck, but nowhere near like that 15% that we initially thought it would be in the format for Prismatic, so I feel like Jamming Tower's safer at 2, and I'd like this to become another consistency card, be it Iono, be it an extra energy, be it a Vessel, something like that. Or even just third gear, because there's even more like integral supporters to try and hit on certain turns. I'm very opinionated on Arch, but overall I really like the list. It's like very similar to how I've been playing the deck, so happy to see that I'm on the right track there. Aban, like I said, unfortunate to have hit the Roaring Moon in the Top Cut brackets. I think otherwise this would have gone much further, where it is the Pidgeot Control, of course. It has the Mist Energy combination that can work on your Milotic package, which is pretty dangerous. Of course, it's not the Mimikyu in here, which is a surprise. You know, you would expect Mimi to be in here, no doubt, but it's the Milotic that stops you picking up Pokemon, which is good against Gardevoir and Arch. There's the Sparkling Scales Milotic EX, which is, of course, very powerful against the Dragapult players. And then you have the Block package and the Sob and whatnot for the other matchups where you require it. And, of course, you know, you can get aggressive with Blood Moon and Luxray as well. Very interesting to see the Water Energy. It means you can get attacking with the Milotic, of course, but it also allows you to use Torrential Pump if you want to have a random, like, aggressive line that your opponent may not expect. Especially when you see DT Sob, you're just expecting that to be over and over again, but there can be times where they go, hey, it's time for a prize race. I feel like it. So that's a cool, like, addition, how the synergy works between Milo and Ogre. That's like a niche thing you don't see every day. Secret Boxes that A-Spec is an interesting one, just giving you a little bit more consistency to work towards crucial support cards. Pretty powerful stuff, though. But yeah, we know that when you're good with Pidgeot, you're just going to, you know, go far, right? That's more or less the long story short. It does have the TM Evo in here for the Milotic, but also the Pidgeotto, which is kind of cool as well. Of course, your Feebas is too vulnerable against the Dragapults, and I think that's also a similar case for the Pidgey, right? So even just getting into Pidgeotto can safeguard you from an early Phantom Dive, so that seems like an important tool to be playing in Pidgeot going forward. Christian Labella was playing Regidrago and was EXO for a large portion of, certainly throughout day 1, I think, and had a really good like day 1 to day 2. Didn't quite make the top 8 cut, but this is a I don't care about Budew, no respect whatsoever list. I think the Churro scenario is the only like hint of potential respect rather than playing a switch. You know, it just has the Prime Catcher and the Churro within the deck rather than the... Oh, and it plays the Lati, so a tiny wince of respect for the Budew, but more or less not caring and just being a powerful deck, which is kind of cool, you know. If you just say that Budew can't hurt you and that you can try and draw well enough against the item lock matchups, and when I say draw well enough, I mean like proactively search Lati or proactively find your E-switches so that you don't care about an item lock because you can just evolve up and attach, and proactively discard, you know, your Dragapult, seeing the extra copy coming back in physically in the list so you can research this away and just see it physically more often in the game. These are kind of the small tweaks that came from Christian to have another really, really strong run. And I wonder if there is going to be an Undertale of Drago coming back. The metagame is not like the most favourable for it, I would say, in terms of the top decks in the field, but if you are slightly gaining percentage into Budew with the way Christian's built the list, maybe it's okay. Joe Fig was the highest placing Lugia, but I think a story of the tournament is that Lugia is back with 3 of them in the top 16 and having a decent day 1 to day 2, so not one to be disrespected. Pretty interesting list from Joe here with the Radzard in here with the Luminous combination, just for an extra low to the ground, high damage output option. There are a lot of decks that have a litter their bench with multi-prize basics, so having a easy boss end game line when your opponent may not expect it, especially when, you know, it's only a 1/1 Cinccino in here. They're either expecting like a Thornton big Cinccino or like this Boss Zard as a late game combination. Can be very powerful. So yeah, it's kind of not stealing any space either because you're going thinner on the rats. So yeah, overall very, very good list there. We have some Guardies, Makani as well. I think we got to see Makani and Piper both on stream piloting their deck. Makani with the interesting Radzard choice rather than like Rad Greninja or just no Radiant whatsoever. Gives you more bench control. I think bench control is really important into Of course, Dragapult, but also mirror matches as well to an extent. Has the Crescent here, so a lot of respect to those sorts of matchups. Expecting to see lots of multi-prize matchups, and then the A-Spec stands out like a sore thumb. The Hyper Aroma in here, so that when you are forced first, you at least have this option to pop off, go wide, and start using your refinements. I actually kind of like this just because of how many decks force you first. And maybe even opt first. Got to think about that. It feels kind of wild to opt first into people, but you do have the Clef Key, and you have the A-Spec. It scares me because it's like just Poffins and Artisans. But maybe there is a world where you do it. And it's one of the few Guardies that I've seen play the Budgie as well, which is kind of sick. I've been a big fan of that, and it's just not come to fruition too often, so... And I guess going first, you can try and get into Budgie on turn 2, Aroma behind all your trades, and just go Buddy for a turn. That's kind of interesting as well. Got to think more about the Hyper Aroma. I haven't played it much myself. Just quickly looking at Piper's list, it was a Heroes Gate build. She talked about this in an interview with Chip at the desk, or during the tournament, about why Heroes Gate was the best. Out of a bad bunch, she said it essentially, which is quite funny to hear, that despite how many good A-Specs have been in Guardi and how fiercely it's debated, she kind of just played this and like shrugged and was like, it's been okay, it lets me be flexible at times, but it's nothing crazy. Has the Devo in here as well as the Flutter and the triple Monkey Dark, so trying to be disruptive in that regard. I think we saw the triple Dark Energy even from, who was it on there winning in? Rowan's winning in, where he had the triple Monkey down. That was really cool to see. Some of the games in Vancouver were very interesting to watch. Definitely the day 2. Or like I wouldn't really watch back much of the day 1. There was a lot of questionable plays going on, but the day 2 there was some sick games. So yeah, rounding out the sort of top decks, more Gholdengo in that top 16 had a really, really good run. Honestly, Gholdengo doing very, very well. Simon Leong is someone I've heard many years ago, having another great placement. Again, sort of taking that benchmark from Grant and going far with Lost Zone Box. Highest placing Clorf was Brandon Salazar. That's a name that definitely pricks my ears up because he's been around a while with some high placements. That Monkey Dark package is certainly overtaking the Iron Valiant. I think that's obvious after the EUIC results as to why. Nothing too outlandish here. It's actually the exact same list as Ryuki's, so still sticking with no Blood Moon, which is a big surprise there. I'm still stunned that there's no Blood Moon, but they're finding different avenues to close games, which is kind of sick to see. Well, in top 64, there was a Terrapagos Dusterwile, which you don't see too often, and a Cyrano supporter in here. Wow, look at that. I did not expect to see this. Grab 3 EXs. Well, that's kind of wild. 3 EXs, pretty good. Turtle, Fez, Pidge. What a turnaround. As soon as your opponent takes 1, you just do that and pop off. That's pretty sick, actually. Huh, kind of cool. You know, whenever you have Jewel Seeker, like, you have to think that, like, you pick this at the time where it's busted and it can be okay. I guess you can always just, like, do other stuff anyway and utilize other supporters. I still don't think it's that sick, but it is surprising to see. No doubt. I did slag off Charizard, as I always do, but there were a couple of them in top 64, so don't write this deck off just yet. It's a fairly routine list. It is a Grand Tree 60, of course, these days, so it has some of those thicker middle evolution lines. I think if you're playing Grand Tree, you also just play TM Evo. It makes sense, right? But I guess you only have 5 energy, so it's not that high odds to actually make it happen. I like the Roxanne as well. I do like Roxanne in Pidgeot Charizard. Yeah, it just feels so bad to have to play Grand Tree when you know it's like a terrible A-Spec. You lose so much like power level. There was also just about in top 64 a Ceruledge. We're going to look in a little bit more detail of a higher placing list from Fortaleza, but this was a blender build, still with that Palkia package, and just the 1 Pokestop in here. Heavy Ball as well. Yeah, that seems pretty reasonable. I do like the 1 Irida in here, to be honest with you. That was something I was testing a lot when I started out testing the Ceruledge. But yeah, pretty interesting stuff overall. I think going forward, looking towards Stockholm, I think we have to really respect Gholdengo. That seemed like it had a great tournament. And I think Lugia back is a question mark. Because I think we can't really slag off Miraidon. It had another like good performance again. Like it underperformed at EUIC for its play rates, but Caleb once again bringing like a high placement, a respectable placement for the deck. And I feel like it should be on day 1 graphic. It was a surprise to me that it wasn't. I guess the question mark is that Regidrago, which is something to think about. But yeah, certainly Gholdengo, Lugia kind of being back, and then another top cut where Gardevoir doesn't make it, which is a surprise. But looking at Fortaleza, it's a different story because Gardevoir was 4 of the top 8, which is crazy to see. This was 700 players in Fortaleza, won by Vinny Fernandez. What an insane player. You know, they've just come off the back from a top 8 at EUIC, and then they go and win the next big tournament there and it's the exact same list that they took, so didn't want to make any changes from EUIC. I imagine they would have been traveling as well between these tournaments, so why change such a great list and having amazing results once again. Awesome to see there. Pedro Patusi, another like very prominent, very strong Brazilian player, bringing the Gardevoir. And this is a surprise to me that some of the top Brazilians stuck with Gardy after having, like, again, not the best of EUICs, I think, for the most parts. Let's see the contingent if they all played the same list. No, they didn't. Okay. But it's a high monkey, triple dark counts. Not too surprising, of course, because you have to respect the Pult matchup, and I think Cress helps out that as well. We're seeing more and more Pheasantipity EX come into list as well. I think that's really just a nod to the fact that your Cresselias get targeted so aggressively that you have that little crumb of draw still in the deck list to, like, keep you going, I suppose, is the idea. And more often with the deck as well, that you are restricting your opponent so much that if they take those prizes, you're going to, like, punish them in other ways. Giovanni Sasso also playing the Guardi with Tomb in here as well. Other than that, not too dissimilar. I'm just quickly looking through all the Guardies. May as well get through them. This one does play the Budju in the list. I would say more often than not, it's not in the 60, but there are some high placing builds with Budju. Always good to look at Williams' deck as well. One of the strongest pilots in Brazil is playing Buddy. Has the 1 Charm, the 1 Lux Cape, though, which you don't often see. The triple Artisan to respect some jamming towers. And the unfair stamps, the A-Spec. So, still so up in the air with Gardevoir. Which A-Spec to play, which tool combination to play, which attacking lineup to play. It feels like that one's really, like, dealer's choice. I really can't put my finger on what the best is either, because of how flexibly Gardevoir can play and, like, how different your lines become just from one different mon in the list. It honestly is that's the case. Let's quickly touch on the other Pult that made top 4 from Francisco. This time back to the Dusknoir build. Quite a thin line of the Dusknoir. And going with the Crystal package. Has a Bravery Charm in the list. That's a surprising one to see. Trying to bulk up your Budus into certain matchups, perhaps. Try to push yourself out of range that your opponent might expect if they're setting up math on you as well. Sometimes Bravery Charming a Duskull can be massive in, like, mirror match situations to just make sure you can still Curse Blast. Maybe even into Gardevoir as well in the mid-game situation. That's a pretty spicy card. I can see the applications here. Protect a Dusk. Make Buddy more dangerous into, like, Arches and Ceruledges, I suppose. And other things that just prod. That's kind of hype. I like that idea. Protecting Duskull sounds so smart, actually. Yeah, I really need to try that. That's sick. Had the Thornton in there as well, which you don't always see, but can pop up, obviously, in a multi-stage 2 deck. Let's have a look at Joel's Roaring Moon. This is the list that I think I prefer. Another one making top 8, of course, which, again, is still surprising, I think it's fair to say, but has that really thick item density still. But I like the, like, ratios of the item choices that little bit more. There's a bit more nuance with the item package here. And I think making the space for 2 Ancient Booster Capsules is really important for the Dragapult matchup. I think not every pot is playing the Vacuum, so having the boosters is a big deal. The one thing I will say is I did like the Penny from Leibui, though, so maybe a combination, a mash of the 2 best performing lists from Brazil and from Vancouver are the best way to go, I would think. Lost Box did make top 8 in Fortaleza as well. What was this list? Okay, just a unique list here. Has the Spiritomb once again. Has the Secret Box. You don't see that very often in Lost Box. It's a 5th Colress, I suppose. Discarding cards in Lost Box is so rough. I remember trying to play, like, 1 Ultra Ball in Lost Box in the past and hating whenever I had to take it from, like, a selecting just to play the game. It feels like you would do that with a Lost Box, with a Secret Box, and be like, 3 discards when all I've done is cherry pick the best cards to my hand with every ability and every supporter I play. But at the end of the day, it is a Colress. And you really are weeping for Colress at times. I suppose with your attacking suite and bundle, you don't always need to be using that prime catcher as well as like a power spike card. Instead, you just use the box as a consistency card. I think if you're doing that, I like double board as well. I think I would go to just like one switch and fit in second rescue board. Maybe the Defiance band that we saw in some of the Miraidon builds could be good. So you could have Blood Moon and Pika pushing their damage output as well. That's a small thing to note. I'm surprised to see Sableye still in here, actually. Most of this drops Sableye by now, right? And just use Greninja and then the multi-prizes. Yeah, interesting stuff, though. The secret box is so interesting. I understand that it's just an extra chorus, but still terrifying. I think one of the big surprises is seeing a Ceruledge go this far because, you know, getting ninth place is a really respectable result, and we've basically been memeing on Ceruledge since the early online stages, I think. And this is a list that won't really blow you away. You know, it's 4 of the important item cards, Secret Box, which I was always a fan of because it's, again, that extra consistency card that helps you play the game. Pokestop over Jamming Tower, I absolutely love. Makes more sense with less Gardevoir in the field as well. Pokestop just lets you play the game. Jet Energy's in here. The 3-3 Ceruledge, sometimes you see a 3-2. It has the Churro as well, so a bit of the same philosophy that you've seen with Gholdengo, where you can just buy a turn back and attach an Abyssal Flames again with your single energy attackers into the Dragapult that's trying to set up lots of awkward math. And again, having 4 Jet, 1 Churro, 1 Pal Pad, you're not losing to control with the 3 Boss in there as well. Yeah, again, it's like a no-nonsense, no-guff 60, but I guess you expect that because you're having to fit in this many energy cards. But Ceruledge real, question mark? Maybe? None of the Pulse or Guardians play Manaphy, right? Like, literally none. So, maybe. Austin decided to go to Brazil rather than to Vancouver and got a 10th place finish, which is pretty good, with the Claw Terapagos. Fit in Blood Moon again. Love to see that. Outside of that, nothing too surprising. Also, Omar with the Ancient Box. Again, this is something that I thought was falling out of favour with less Gardevoir, but it seems to be holding its own. I think it's actually pretty good into Gholdengo. I think it's pretty good into Miraidon. So there are still some boast matchups. Obviously, those are like lower thresholds for you to have to reach, and they don't have much flexibility in the format. So Ancient Box can still bully a decent number of decks. There was another Ceruledge in top 16. Wow, Ceruledge. You know what? Ceruledge is back. It's more Secret Box. I'm so happy. I'm actually so happy Secret Box is doing well. Another really cool thing to see was Bastion's list of Palkia and Noctowl. The reason is it's kind of like mashing the Tord approach that we saw in Japan, where it has the Ogopon, Pikachu, Crystal, and the double Crispin in here. And obviously you have Star Portal, you have E-Switch, and you have Trumpet as well. So you have energy flying all over the board with this approach. So it is like a new age build. One thing I thought about with Prismatic Palkia was playing Chorus's Tenacity plus 1 Jet, so you can assault landing Budgews, but maybe just fall prey to instant stamp anyway if people are doing that, if you're doing that into people, and maybe you can still make things move together. Obviously you have Lati in the deck as well, and you can just like Crispin to retreat stuff if you really have to. So maybe get around it that way. Like you can always just knock out for Crispin, attach to the Fan Rotor and retreat and get in. So maybe you don't need the Chorus Jet, especially if you're playing the Pikachu. Actually, now that I think about it, I think the Crispin is just better. But yeah, Pikachu for some burst damage, still a really annoying attacker for some matchups. It can like still just demand respect and insta win you some matchups. Definitely like Lugia struggles into this card, for example, right? And that's coming back. Gholdengo struggles into this card because they're, you know, you're not going to be setting up Monkey Dory numbers for them in that instance, so they won't have a way around the peak. Definitely something I want to try. I still feel like this engine is cracked, and now that we've seen that like Noctowl can make all the silly combinations come together, why don't we just like work them into one deck and keep Palkia for one last ride? Definitely something I'm thinking about for Stockholm. Gouging Fire, another great placement. Is it still the same list? No, it's a different list than what we've seen before, but only minor tweaks here. Has the Inferno Wings Moltres as a single prize attacking option. Not something you see every day. And it had the Thornton in there as well. That's also a surprise. Iron Thorns in top 32. Still having decent placements with the Legacy Energy in the list. I suppose there are less Sinnohs out there these days, but still enough that you can get around it. Still, wow, a couple of them in top 32 actually. Good run for the Thorns. I wasn't really expecting Thorns to make much of a resurgence, but there you go. With Dragapult being such a difficult matchup, I wouldn't have expected it. Raging Bolt in 64 as well. This isn't playing the Lati, it's just very item dense. And just shrugging in the face of a Budgie, I suppose. Which is still fine. I think the big takeaways from this tournament is that Gardy, with still multiple iterations, is capable of winning a tournament on any given day, with some of the best pilots in Brazil still choosing it as the strongest pick. Ceruledge, we have to start respecting it. The Palkia is very, very cool. Got to give that some time, because it's kind of a mixture of towards Japanese list and still keeping the strong elements of current standard, where you still have Greninja to cycle those energy, which is pretty powerful, actually. And Roaring Moon as well. Let me know your thoughts on both those tournaments before we get back to post-row. Jack is working really, really hard, I promise, editing post-row stuff, and we're very excited to bring that to you, but we're making sure it's absolutely squeaky clean and perfect and well made. So keep an eye out for that. Let me know your thoughts on both tournaments and how you did, if you attended any of them, and what you're thinking for Stockholm or for Australia. I think it's Brisbane, right? Let me just make sure that it's Brisbane. It is at the end of this month, before we start looking towards rotation. Thanks so much for watching, guys. I'll see you tomorrow for another one. Cheers.